Chapter 1. Joshua. Josh Watson fired a quick text off to his friend Lily. "I'm going in." He didn't wait for a reply, knowing if she were available to play, she would meet him there. If not, he would try to find another partner or perhaps even attempt to join a campaign solo. It was always much safer with a good wingmate though, and they didn't come any better than Lily. His wife Karen was in another one of those moods, so he had escaped into his computer room to give her some space. He heard the distant slam of the front door as she left, probably headed over to her sister's again to wind down. This was happening more and more lately. They were slowly drifting apart, and the sad thing was, he was not sure it wasn't entirely all his fault. He thought he still loved her, but the passion had died somewhere along the way, and he was doing nothing to rekindle it. Instead, whenever she got to the point where a fight was imminent, he fled to the sanctuary of his computer room and just left her to herself to calm down. He could feel the distance and wondered how much farther they could drift before they were too far apart to save. He wondered if it even mattered to her anymore, since she wasn't really doing anything to rekindle it either. He also wondered if she was cheating yet. Sooner or later she would. They always did. This wasn't his first rodeo. He logged on to his Angels at War account and donned his VR gear as he mentally prepared to battle evil for a while. This game was a perfect outlet for his pent-up frustrations. It had plenty of action and adventure, and in there he didn't have to worry about the mounting pressures from his failing marriage. It was a welcome escape to be able to enter the make-believe world of demons and angels, battling evil and becoming someone else entirely. For a while anyway. Sooner or later, he always had to return to reality and face the issues that were plaguing his life. Try to fix whatever he could with her, apologize for things that were never meant to hurt, feel unwarranted guilt for things totally out of his control. Everything would level out again after she calmed down. But for now, Joshua was glad he had this world to escape to. He had all the latest peripherals, including the full body sim suit that picked up his slightest movements and recreated them in full motion within the game. It also delivered feedback pressures that simulated all the various resistances and was capable of giving some fairly painful feedback whenever a foe was lucky enough to land a blow against him. It was carefully calibrated to not leave bruises, but he had it set as high as he can get away with to up the realism within the game. He didn't like pain much, so it was a great motivator to not allow too much to get through his defenses. He felt it made him a much better player if there were real-world consequences to being careless. Dying hurt like a bitch, so he tried to not do that very often. God, he loved this game. It allowed him to fly around on feathery silver wings, swinging his flaming sword of death down on all of the demon spawn that were trying to corrupt the world of man. There were structured campaigns where people were expected to work together as a team, but there was also plenty of freedom to explore and create your own agenda if you didn't feel up to following a scripted battle plan. The Angels didn't always win either. There were no guarantees that any particular campaign would result in a victory or gain anyone any personal points in the lists. Each campaign was totally dependent on the skills of all its participants, very much like real life, no guarantees. It was quite in contrast to the boring reality of his own life, which was not exactly what anyone would call adventurous. He was average looking, short in stature, and perhaps even a bit on the flabby side due to the lack of any real exercise in his cubicle-contained corporate existence. He was very good with numbers, but had no real path to advance his career unless he jumped jobs. That was something he was reluctant to do with the economy the way it was right now. So instead, he resigned himself to remain a junior data analyst for the time being, even if he was merely another faceless cog on the machine. The corporate world of finance may not even know he existed, but it paid the bills. The Angels at War simulation had given him an outlet for all of his daily frustrations, not just the looming implosion of his marriage. He remembered the day he discovered an online ad asking for beta testers, surprised to find that such a complex world was out there waiting for him to conquer. He had been one of the first to sign up, and it had provided him with many, many hours of adventurous excitement over the last 3 years. Karen wouldn't play it herself, saying that the entire premise of angels being so violent borderlined on blasphemy in her religious opinion. She held tightly to the vision that angels were peaceful creatures that were meant to simply help guide dying souls home to heaven, not deliver demons back to the depths of hell by the blunt edge of a sword. Joshua had never begrudged her faith, but had made it clear from the start that he did not share in her religious beliefs. He was agnostic and quite happy with that fact. She was not a particularly devout Christian either, unless it suited her interests, but she was entitled to whatever faith she chose to believe in, as long as she had the same respect and didn't push her beliefs off on him. It was an uneasy truce, but he had managed to convince her that this game was harmless and that he was actually learning quite a bit of religious history from the experience. Who knows? In time, he may even find it might help to convince him to share in her beliefs. So, she reluctantly allowed him his 2 or 3 hours of gameplay, usually at the night after he had completed a long honey-do list of household chores, while she found other things to occupy her time. She usually didn't complain about it much. Joshua settled back into the padded recess of his computer lounger and tried to set aside his marital issues and just lose himself in the game for a while. He had a battle to prepare for and needed his wits if he wanted to survive and score high enough to matter. Saving damsels in distress was an everyday occurrence for him in there, but it didn't earn many personal points in the list. For that, one had to be truly courageous and skilled with both sword and defensive magic, which he was, since he was currently one of the top players on the status board. He figured he was only about one more good campaign away from breaking into the final upper levels of the game. There were only 5 other players in the same league as he was, and all of them had fought beside him many times in the past battles. He had some serious respect for them all, but had grown quite attached to one woman in particular who was simply awesome in battle. You couldn't ask for a better wingmate. She always had your back. She went by the unlikely name of Lillian there, but he suspected that was probably not the name she answered to out here in the real world. He had stuck with Joshua when he created his avatar, simply because he felt it fit in with the overall biblical theme. He later learned it really didn't matter much. There were just as many angels named Bob and Christy in there as there were Caleb and Isabella's. Lillian was a better fighter than he was sure of that, but they fought together more often than not, and she never complained that he lacked any skills. She knew his strengths and weaknesses nearly as well as he knew hers, and together they were quite formidable. She was also another one of the senior beta testers who, like himself, had been there from the beginning. They had grown a strong friendship based on mutual respect for each other's intellect and gameplay, even though they lived a continent apart out here in the real world and would likely never meet each other face to face. As he settled in, he initiated the game and the computer room slowly dissolved around him as the augmented reality in his suit visor began to immerse him within the game universe. The familiar confines of his home faded away and left him suspended within a pale gray mist with no discernible light source. This neutral mist was always waiting whenever one entered or left the game, or when one died in battle. It was meant to be symbolic of crossing the barrier between heaven and earth. When the initiating mist cleared, he found himself standing in his barracks cubicle, which was a simple room sparsely decorated in about a 10-foot by 10-foot square. It had no bed, but 3 of the walls were lined with shelves that were stacked with weapons and armor he had acquired from the previous campaigns. The 4th wall held a large double door left standing open and leading out onto a balcony that had no railing, despite the drop of several thousand feet to the distant green fields below. He ignored the view through the open doorway, knowing it rarely changed. The barracks formation was invisibly anchored to the terrain below, and the weather up here was always temperate and stable, no matter what season it was down below in the world of man. In the center of the room, an ornate carved pedestal rose from the polished marble floor, which housed the interface linked to the mainframe artificial intelligence, known here as Destiny. He stepped over to it now and stated, "Destiny, Reporting in. Ready for duty.
Good afternoon, Joshua.
A pleasant female voice answered.
What are you in the mood for today? There are several campaigns with a high probability of needing an angel with your strengths. Unfortunately, there is also a high probability that each of them will result in your death and failure to bring lightness to the land. The dark forces have been gaining a much stronger foothold on the mortal plane in your absence.
How much time has elapsed since my last duty rotation? He had last logged in about 2 days ago real time, but the time flow within the framework always varied once you logged off. It could be a simple 1-to-1 ratio, with each day outside of the simulation resulting in a single day passing within, or could be dramatically sped up or slowed down. He once finished an epic battle and then returned to find that over 1,000 years had elapsed in his overnight absence. Entire cities had fallen to ruin and new ones had risen to take their place. Once a person logged in, they were synced into whatever the current time frame was, and time passed subjectively on a 1-to-1 ratio. If a person needed to pause the game to deal with a real-life issue, time still passed here. Every minute that passed while their avatar was suspended in stasis still passed as a minute within the simulation for the rest of the people playing there, since it was a multiplayer game. The battle raged on around your frozen avatar, but it could not be harmed while surrounded by the blue glow that signified a player was AFC, or away from control. The tide of an entire battle could turn if one of the key players had to stop and take a leak.
It has been 3 years, 7 months and 16 days since your last duty rotation.
3.5 years wasn't too bad. At least the map shouldn't have changed too much from what he remembered from his last campaign. Has Lily logged on yet? Lately they tried to time their real world and entry into the simulation as close together as they could, in order to team up and split the available points from any campaign evenly between themselves. Lily knew how close both of them were to leveling up, and rumor had it that the next leveling might promote them both to Archangel status. Nobody knew what that entailed as far as rank and privilege, but he wanted both of them to be the first of the gamers to achieve that status here.
The angel known to you as Lily has reported she is currently available for duty. Shall I tell her you are inquiring?
Has she chosen a campaign yet?
No. She is in the Situation Hall, looking them over right now.
Please inform her I will meet her there.
Blessings and good luck, Joshua. May the light shine bright on your blade and guide it true.
This was Destiny's standard sign-off, a blessing of sorts that he actually took to heart, regardless of the fact it was delivered by an AI computer. It was probably his imagination, but sometimes in the heat of battle with a demon, where he was outmatched in both strength and endurance, he actually did feel as though an outside force was guiding his blade. His sword struck truer and did more damage than he felt it really should have. It was usually just enough of an edge to allow him to prevail. Not always, of course. He still died more often than he would have liked. But sometimes he didn't die when he felt he really should have. It was probably a randomly generated event, or else something programmed into the game to help guide the action to follow some behind-the-scenes script and to keep things moving along a more or less preset pattern. Sometimes he found it very hard to remember that this is just a game when he was swinging a sword and battling for his life. And that was really the whole point. The game designers wanted you to feel like you had free will, but they had to have some sort of game plan, right? Otherwise, it would devolve into utter chaos. Joshua stepped out onto his balcony and energized his wings, flexing them out to their full 15-foot wingspan, then furling them back into a more relaxed resting position, arching high above his shoulder blades with the wingtips just barely clearing the ground. They were usually stored in the rune glyphs tattooed across his back while grounded to avoid unnecessary injury to them. Despite their fragile appearance, they were actually quite rugged and fast-healing, but it never paid to expose them to risks that were avoidable. An angel without his wings was pretty much crippled and useless in any kind of fight, and they took quite a while to regenerate if they were severed off completely. This had only happened to him once, very early on, when he was learning the limits to what was possible in this world and what wasn't. He had allowed a demon to get inside his guard and had suffered the consequences as it disarmed him and chewed them both off, leaving him grounded with 2 bloody stubs where his wings used to be. Then it had merely laughed and refused to kill him. He had been forced to walk away from a battle in disgrace, watching helplessly from the ground as the dark forces prevailed and destroyed his fellow crusaders for the light. It was only then that he discovered his wings would regenerate in about 3 weeks, but it was real-time, subjective. While they healed, he had to spend 3 entire weeks of real-time gameplay, grounded in fighting as a disguised warrior amongst the mortal human counterparts of this world that he was supposed to be divinely protecting from above. It was actually a very good learning experience and helped solidify in his mind that the whole divine mission he was supposed to be fighting was a worthwhile cause. He had begun to have doubts that any of the battles he fought were really anything more than an exercise to advance an angel's personal standings in the list. But living on the ground had taught him that the citizens of this world had to live with the outcome if the angels failed to drive the darkness from the land. Oh sure, the mortal humans he fought beside were purely AI constructs, but they had very realistic emotions and bled just as red as any real person he had ever met. He learned he had a very high level of empathy for them, constructs or not, and it hurt just as much to watch any of them die as it did to see one of his fellow angels struck down. And there was no resurrection for them. If an angel died in battle, he paid for that in pain and lost serious points in the standings, but was able to learn from his error and take that lesson into his next battle. But if a mortal human died, there was no returning. This one life was all they had, and they were all as self-protecting of it as anyone else. They were not cowards, but they wouldn't blindly throw themselves into harm's way either. It was a lesson he remembered long after he regained the freedom of the skies again, and he felt it made him a far better warrior for the light. He honestly believed in the fight. Joshua unfurled his wings and dove from his balcony in a long, graceful glide towards a large building about a half-mile away. The Situation Hall, where the angels all gathered to get their assignments, was a lavish granite building several stories tall and the size of a full city block square, floating majestically among the clouds several thousand feet above the world of man below. As he made his approach to the receiving perch, he reflected on the fact that he had been inside very few of the buildings surrounding him, but he assumed that they all served various purposes to support the cause of light. One of these days, maybe he could convince Lily to hold off joining the campaign long enough to go exploring. The city of angels that he lived in was known in human mythology as Winghaven. It held many large buildings similar to the Situation Hall, all widely scattered but tethered to the ground below by some force he never thought to question. And like most things divine, this entire city was invisible to the eyes of mortal man looking up from below. That was actually kind of sad, considering the city was extremely beautiful when viewed as a whole from any distance at all. But its beauty was reserved strictly for the angels themselves. As an angel, Joshua was usually invisible to most mortals as well, unless he made a conscious effort to reveal himself, or like that time when he was gravely injured. An angel had no choice but to be visible then, in order to live among the mortal humans long enough to heal. After he gracefully landed on the perch, he glanced back up to the barracks formation behind him where he stored his gear. It was simply a loose cluster of small buildings that had an oddly fabricated look about them, but he noted that it had grown considerably in the time he had been fighting here. In fact, this whole city had grown since he first arrived as a beta tester almost 3 years ago, and the virtual rendering had almost improved dramatically from those early days. Oh sure, you could still tell it was all CGI, but the resolution was very, very good. It was easy to get lost in the illusion. He retracted his wings into their storage glyphs with a practiced shrug of his shoulders, barely noticing the mildly painful process as they dissolved into energy and were absorbed back into the tattoos emblazoned on the skin of his back. Rune storage was handy. He had runes tattooed on the inside of each of his forearms as well, that contained both his sword and shield. He was never unarmed, and his own personal sword had the advantage that it could never be used against him either, since it was keyed to his body and refused to hurt him. The light chainmail under armor he wore stitched itself into an unbroken weave across his back again once the transformation of his wings was complete. Clothing here tended to adapt to angelic preference all on its own, and was nothing he had to consciously think about. It just happened. Call it magic. Everyone else here does. Joshua turned back towards the large open doorway that led to the great hall and strode inside confidently, looking for his wingmate. He was comfortable here. He was home again.